This week we're making some bubbling hot tar pits for your game table. This was a request by my DM, and I don't know why I keep building things for him to use against me and my party.
He's going to be a little bit different than what I normally make. Usually I've got a lot of plants and colour, but today we're making something dead and rotten.
To start the build, we're going to need to make some bases. So I'm grabbing some thin MDF board and some power tools to cut out a basic round random shape. You could cut this out using a box cutter, and I'd probably recommend that as these power tools were a little bit overkill for the job. Once we had them cut out, I then grabbed a box cutter and trimmed up the sides. Basically just trying to take that harsh lip off the side so it blends down nicer into the table when placed down with other terrain. And now we have some nice clean bases. I'm grabbing out some foam clay to build up our first bit of earth. This stuff's great as it's really easy to form shapes with. It'll stick down nice and make a really clean watertight finish. I basically am just running this around the edge of both of our base pieces, building up an embankment around the edges of our tar pits. This is going to come in handy later when we pour resin to keep everything from spilling out.
So this isn't a bad start. They're looking honestly pretty average. So what we're going to do is carve out some rocks out of foam, build up a bit more texture and variation around the sides, and then we're going to come in and texture these up a little bit more to make it look like the earth has been pushed up as whatever has caused these tar pits has forced its way up from underground.
Now, there are a lot of ways to make rocks. I'm going to be using some XPS foam and just basically taking these scraps from old builds and hacking into them, carving away random shapes and just making these really random, interesting rock-like textures, then sticking them in place around the edges of our tar pit. As I start to do more and more work, I'm basically adding more range to the edges of our build. I'm also going to be using some of these rock molds from the Woodland Scenics rock mold collection. Some of these are done with resin and some with plaster. These are just leftovers that I've got from old builds, but they help to add that extra bit of pattern and rock texture and just something different to the sides of our build. You don't need these, you could easily just do this with foam, but I have them, so I'm using them. Honestly, you could even use real rocks and you'd be coming out just fine in the end. The more I build onto these, the more I realize I don't want it to be a perfectly round shape. So I start adding a few more larger rock sections into the insides of the tar pit to give us a bit more of a random natural look, as rarely in nature does something come up in a perfectly round shape. Once we have a good rock shape in place, I'm going to mix up some sculptor mold. This is my homemade recipe that I use in a lot of builds, and you can find the link to how to make it yourself right here. You basically just mix the sculptor mold in with PVA glue and water and mix it up till you have a good consistency. Once that's ready, I'm just going to start heavily applying this around the edges of our build, covering up all of the foam sections. This might cover up some of your rocky areas, but that's fine. This stuff just gives a really nice, natural, earthy texture and has that nice, random, realistic nature feel, which looks just a lot cleaner than that foam in my opinion. Once all that's dry, I give the entire thing a coat in a Mod Podge and black paint mixture to seal everything up nicely. This is mostly just important for the foam sections if you're using spray paint, but it's also a really nice base coat. Once that's dry, we grab a matte black to give a nice base to all of our tar pit areas. You could also probably use a gloss, in fact it would probably be a better option. And now for my favourite texture paint, the Tamiya Soil Effects. I'm basically going to just take a chunk of this, mix a little bit of water in, and start applying it heavily over all of our earth areas. I use this on pretty much all my builds as I love the way that it dries looking really nice and natural. I'm coming back in again to touch up all of those stones with the grey as I kind of covered a bit more of them than I would have liked, and I wanted to go with a bit of a brighter grey for our base tone. And then taking a much brighter grey again and dry brushing that over all of our rocks. This really brings them to life and is the easiest way to get a really nice natural looking stone texture. Now, since I can't add any life to this build, I want to put in some dead trees. So I grab a few sticks from the backyard and super glue them in place. adding them sort of randomly all around the edges just to give us that little bit of something extra to really make it look like this was a forested area that was killed as these tar pits erupted from the ground. Now that we have all of our trees in place, I'm going to be using some of this notch scenics and some parsley leaves to add a whole heap of dead foliage and fallen leaves, helping to sell the idea that these tar pits have killed everything around them. I start with the small stuff from Notch and then add more patches of glue closely around any edges where I think dead leaves would have formed and start scattering on some of these parsley leaves. These are a great way to make that fallen leaf kind of texture without spending a whole heap of money.
Now it's time to add in our tar pits. For this, we're going to be using some epoxy resin with some black ink. And to add some bubbles, I'm going to be using these tiny little glass beads that I picked up on Amazon. These little guys are going to get dunked in our resin and sort of spread around the side to look like bubbles pulling up through our tar pits. So let's mix up the resin, add in some black ink, and see how this goes. Alternatively, you could probably just mix a bit of wood glue with some black paint and add that in. It should give you a fairly similar result, but you know what? I might try that on one and try the resin on the other and compare the two to see how they turn out.
So we mix up the 2-part epoxy. This is a 2-to-1 mix, and I do my best to try and measure this out using these small measuring cups. I'm then adding a whole heap of black ink to really give us that dark black tar look. It took quite a bit of ink to really get this solid, but once I was happy, I started pouring it out over our build. This is a self-leveling epoxy, but I'm going to push it into all the edges just to make sure it gets into where I want, and then I want to add some bubbles. So I grab out these little glass beads and start scattering them throughout the build. I didn't love the way they looked by themselves, so I threw down some cheap black acrylic paint and mixed a whole heap of these beads in, covering them in that black. Then pulling them out one at a time and dropping them into our tar pit. This gave us a really nice dark black bubbly look to really represent that this was a poisonous, moving, living tar pit. And I loved how much this looked that I repeated that same process on our smaller piece. I had a whole heap of leftover resin, so I just poured some out on a silicone mat and added a whole heap more of the bubbles. This way we would have little bits of tar to throw down around the game board, either as a special attack from our enemy or just to represent that the whole area is kind of been infected by this toxic ooze. That all got a day to dry, and then we have some really nice extra pieces of tar scatter terrain. When you hold them up like this, they are a little bit transparent, but they look great when they're sitting down on the table, giving us a really handy way to use up any leftover resin and giving us more playability with this scatter terrain.
So our main pieces are done and they're looking good, but I want to test out the PVA glue option. So I've thrown together a basic board piece that I can test this out in.
Essentially, this is a torn up piece of MDF with some expanding foam sprayed on there randomly. Once this is dry, I carve it back, add some sculptor mold and some rocks, and give the entire thing a rough paint job, similarly to what we did earlier.
Ultimately, when I'm done with this, I'll be able to repaint over my PVA glue tar pit and try and turn this into some kind of watering hole or rock pool and add a whole heap of grass and just make it more reusable. But for now, it's really just a tester so we can see how the black PVA glue goes as a cheaper comparison to the resin pour.
So I basically just mix up a heap of PVA glue with some black paint and add in some Liquitex black ink, as I didn't think the black paint was really making it dark enough. Once it was mixed up enough, I pour it out into our tar pit, push it out into all of the sides, and then do the same effect with those glass beads to add some bubbles. When I first poured these in, they kind of disappeared underneath the level of glue. But once this had a chance to dry, the glue really pulled back and revealed a lot more of the bubbles than probably I would have liked. I really wasn't a big fan of this style, but hey, it's a cheaper option and it does the trick for anyone out there that doesn't want to mess with resin. But it doesn't compare to the resin pour tar pit that we built to start. Combining all of those little bits of extra scatter tar along with our small pit, we have a really nice table to be able to throw down for any war game or TTRPG encounter.
And I had a lot of fun playing on this terrain. The DM threw it out for that encounter that we played over at Tomes and Tales RPG, and it worked out beautifully on the table, giving us the ability to throw these down around the table to play in as extra effects or just fill in more of the game table. It was great having that extra bit of scatter. If you want to see the game in full, check out Tomes and Tales RPG, where that episode will be going live in just a few weeks.
But for now, I will leave you with some beautiful hero shots showing these dead, oozy tar pits with bubbling, boiling tar pouring out from the earth, which seem like the perfect encounter terrain for a black dragon.
And there we have some beautiful, creepy looking tar pits for a perfect monstrous encounter.
I hope you guys have found something you like in this build, and we'll be back to some more colourful builds in the next few episodes. But until next time, never stop making stuff.